Hello everybody and welcome back. It is good to talk to all of you again today, and today I have another Know Your Ship episode, and this is the USS Yorktown CV-10, one of the ships of the Essex class of carriers built during the Second World War. This ship is currently a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina, and as you can see, absolutely beautiful ship. So how I'm going to do this video is I'm going to sort of just take you through the places that I was going sort of one after another, right? So as you enter the ship, the first place you go is the hangar deck. Now, the hangar deck on the Yorktown is quite a large space. As you can see, they've actually managed to cram in a medium bomber on one side, although the majority of the aircraft is on the other side. Here we go, that's the shot. Most of the Second World War aircraft is actually on the hangar deck, and maybe that's just because they actually fit compared to some of the other aircraft that ended up being a little bit too big for her, and they're stored on the actual main deck. So, nice large space. And of course, the very first aircraft you see is actually this F9F-6 Cougar. And you can actually sit in this aircraft. I mean, there's a set of stairs, you get in there, you can sit down and actually get a feel of what it's like to be in this Cougar's cockpit. Although the area is not in the best shape possible. Anyways, a little bit about this particular aircraft. The F9F-6 Cougar is a development from the F9F Panther. And what happened was that the US encountered swept-wing MiG-15s during the Korean War, realized that their straight-wing jets weren't really going to cut it, so they basically made an advancement on the straight-wing aircraft and created this one with the swept wings. Of course, better performance. Plane is still subsonic, however. In terms of weapons armament, to my knowledge, 420mm cannons and can equip Sidewinder missiles as well. The first Cougar squadron was deployed aboard the USS Yorktown. However, by the time they got this plane out into the field, the Korean War had already ended, so she never actually saw any actual combat against MiG-15s. Although I can definitely say I have this man in my sights. Anyways, here's another view of this hangar. In terms of size, the hangar is roughly 200 meters long, about 21.5 meters wide, and about 5.5 meters in height, providing roughly 23,350 cubic meters in space. Now, there were some modifications done to this particular ship. She was modernized twice, but I'm not 100% sure if those modernizations had any effect on hangar space. None of the documentation I've been able to find has indicated anything of that nature, that or they just weren't specific enough. Anyways, moving on the hangar deck, you'd find many Second World War aircraft, like I mentioned, one of these being the F-4F Wildcat, the primary naval fighter for the U.S. Navy in the early stages of the Pacific War. Now, the F-4F Wildcat did not serve aboard the USS Yorktown CV-10. This particular fighter did serve, however, on board the USS Yorktown CV-5 of the Yorktown class, which participated in many of the major early Pacific battles, including notable battles like the Battle of Midway. In many of these sort of early engagements against the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Wildcat, well, it did okay. In terms of combat records against Zeros, all the research I've been able to look at so far indicated that it was pretty even to a 1-to-1 record. Of course, nothing compared to the ratios achieved by later fighters like this F-6F Hellcat and of course the F-4U Corsair. When the Yorktown CV-10 entered service, she started off with F-6F Hellcats as her primary fighter. In fact, her composition of aircraft over her World War II career actually went from somewhat balanced to much more fighter heavy. So in 1943 she had 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo aircraft. In 1944, that ratio had gone to 54 fighters, 24 bombers, and 18 torpedo aircraft. And by 1945, the ratio was 73 fighters to 15 dive bombers and 15 torpedo aircraft, I think reflecting very much the changing nature and roles of U.S. Navy carriers in the later stages of the Second World War. One final note about the F-6F Hellcat is that that particular fighter was responsible for something like 56% of all aircraft killed by U.S. Navy and Marine Corps pilots during the Second World War. Some pretty astounding figures. Now, late in the war, the Hellcat squadrons on board the Yorktown were replaced by Corsair squadrons. There's quite a cool story about these particular aircraft. They're excellent fighters, but they weren't really great at landing. And so after a couple of pretty nasty accidents, the US Navy deemed them not really suitable for carrier service. So these aircraft got passed on to the Marines, who used them from land bases and, of course, experienced much success with them. These fighters were also provided to the Royal Navy, and it's in the service of the Royal Navy where her problems were kind of rectified. The Royal Navy was looking for a shipborne naval fighter, and this was the best they got. And even after some pretty nasty accidents, what else were they going to replace them with, right? So the Royal Navy went about developing a bunch of things that would make these planes better. One of them was the fact that, and it's sort of by coincidence, was that when the Corsair's wings were folded up, there wasn't enough clearance on Royal Navy carriers. So what they did was they sort of trimmed off a little bit of the wingtips. Now this actually helped improve the sink rate of the aircraft, making it less floaty and easier to control. One other technique developed by Royal Navy pilots was that they would approach the carrier for landing at a sort of a gentle turn. And by doing that turn, they were able to keep their eyes on the deck of the carrier until pretty much just before the point of landing. Now, this was in very big contrast to US Navy pilots, which came into their carrier sort of, from straight astern. And by doing that, they weren't able to see the decks, right, leading to a lot of accidents. This technique, developed by Royal Navy pilots, was eventually adopted by Marine Corps and US Navy pilots when the Corsair was reintroduced for carrier service. Other aircraft that are on display in the hangar include this TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, as well as you'll see a Dauntless dive bomber in a second as well. One other thing I did forget to mention a little bit earlier was that, with the fighters, take a look at the difference between the F4F Wildcat and the later war aircraft, right? The Hellcat and the Corsair. Big difference in size and, of course, capability as well. Going back to the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber again for a second, these particular aircraft from the Yorktown were actually involved in the strike against the Yamato and were responsible for some of the torpedo hits that she took. Also on display is, like I mentioned earlier, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers, which served as dive bombers and also scout planes for the Yorktown CV-10. They are, however, most famous for their role during the Battle of Midway in destroying a good chunk of Japan's carrier force. Now, on the other side of the hangar is the B-25 medium bomber. Now, this particular bomber, most famously, participated in the Doolittle raid and bombing Tokyo. Not really an aircraft that you would normally see, however, conducting carrier operations. In the hangar, you would also find an example of the quad 40mm Bofors AA gun. Now, when the Yorktown was first commissioned, she had 8 of these quad mounts for 32 guns in total, but of course, as the war progressed and aircraft, especially kamikazes, became an even bigger threat, more of these guns were put onto the ship. And by the end of 1944, there would be a total of 17 mounts, totaling 68 guns altogether. Now, the very first room I visited after the main sort of hangar deck was this particular room, and this is the torpedo workshop. And you might be looking at that torpedo and going, that doesn't look like a World War II torpedo. Nope, definitely not. And this is a much, much later torpedo used in the 1960s. It was an anti-submarine torpedo. And you're probably looking at this and wondering, well, why is there an anti-submarine torpedo on this particular carrier? Well, the Yorktown, after World War II, underwent 2 modifications. And the first of these modifications was the SCB-27A modification. But do keep in mind that the A modification was only done for some of the carriers. Some of the other Essex class carriers got the SCB-27C modifications. And the main difference between these 2 modifications is the A modifications got the H-8 hydraulic catapults, while the C modifications got steam catapults. Now, initially in the 50s, this didn't really impact the Yorktown all that much. However, into the 60s, the ship's role had to change, as the hydraulic catapults just weren't really enough to deal with the latest, greatest jet aircraft. So she went from an attack carrier to an anti-submarine warfare carrier. Now, unfortunately, the museum's World War II era Mark 13 torpedo was not in the torpedo workshop. It's actually with the TBM Avenger torpedo bomber. But it would have been nice to see sort of the size difference. The World War II era torpedo was like 2,200 pounds and a significantly bigger weapon, while this one was 432 pounds, much, much, much smaller. Moving away from the torpedo workshop, we enter this area, which at first doesn't look like much, but this is actually the bomb elevator. Now, obviously in carrier operations, you don't really want your bombs to be stored in places where they're vulnerable. You kind of want to put them in places that might have a bit of armor and protection. So you have to move them from the protected area up onto the deck to be loaded onto aircraft. So they did that with the monorails that you see on top, the yellow one, and the bomb would get moved into this area, put on a cart, put inside the elevator, and sent up. Now, after the two rooms dealing with weapons, you come to the place that deals with, well, food. First of all, I'm really hungry because it's like the early morning and seeing bacon and sausages and, okay, not thinking about food at this particular hour. Okay, it's hard to resist, right? And the food looks so darn real. Anyways, okay, so the galley prepared food for approximately 3,500 sailors on a daily basis, and in approximately about a month, they go through about 120 tons, yes, tons, worth of food. Quite a lot, if you ask me, and by the way, that doesn't include the bakery either. Once I got past the galley area, well, entered the laundry area, and of course, on a carrier, the laundry facilities are quite extensive. After all, they did have to take care of the laundry for thousands of people, right? And then of course there was this little area which had the washers and the dryers. I'm thinking this one, I'm not really sure which one this is actually, it might have been a dryer, but they had it so it's simulated to have stuff going around in circles. I don't know, it was just kind of mesmerizing. I looked at it, I was like, that's kind of cool, and sort of stared at it for a little bit. Now, after the laundry area, I got to a room where I can legitimately say I spent maybe a little bit too much time, and this is what the room kind of looked like. And according to the volunteer who was working there, most people would just walk right by it, but me being me, I sort of said, "What's this room?" And the person said, "Well, there's a lot of old documents and stuff like that, and this room is, well, pretty much in disarray, right?" So they were there to tidy this room up, and of course I was like, can I come in and take a look? And of course there were things like Bureau of Ship prints, with diagrams and blueprints of ships, electrical wiring diagrams. There were a lot of manuals and things as well, all kinds of manuals. And apparently they keep getting sent more stuff by people too, even if it had no relation to the carrier. So they really had to decide, whether they want to keep things or not keep things, right? So for example, one of the books here talked about chemical warfare defense. Kind of an interesting book to find. I kind of flipped through a couple pages, but I mean, there was only so much time. I mean, if I was able to stay there for the whole day, I think I would have. There were, of course, also log books, aircraft recovery log books, landing logs, etc. And of course, all these things are like the stuff from way back in the day. And hold on a second, I've got a picture of it. There you go. The activity for the ship's anti-submarine aircraft, the S-2F tracker. So a lot of these old books, very, very cool to take a look at. And by the way, for those of you who are maybe somewhere near Charleston, South Carolina, maybe if you want to volunteer and help out, you could probably call the museum and ask them if they're looking for volunteers. I'm not sure if this project is still going on. This was done in December of last year after all, and it is like April now. But if you're curious about this project, maybe ask for Mr. Millman. He is the gentleman who I talked to when I was at the museum, and he was the one in the room who actually let me in. It was super nice. So, Mr. Millman, if you ever watch this, thank you for, let's say, entertaining me on that day and letting me hang around the room for that period of time. Moving on, and we get to the bakery, which is, while it was still active, one of the nicest smelling places on the ship. However, by the time I got there, well, it's just a room with stuff in it, like ovens and stuff. Still, if you wanted the recipe for 10,000 chocolate chip cookies, there you go. That is the amount of stuff you're going to need to make 10,000 chocolate chip cookies. Now, as to the reason why you would want to make 10,000 cookies, well, I don't know. Maybe you're the cookie monster or something. Okay, moving on, and here we are at the medical area of the ship. And the carrier's medical facility was the most comprehensive medical facility I saw on any of the ships I was able to visit. They're bigger than the battleships, although the battleship was pretty comprehensive as well. And most of this really has to do with the fact that, one, yes, they had huge crews, but also because these were capital ships, the carriers and the battleships, and they were responsible for taking care of sailors from smaller ships, like, for example, destroyers that might not have had as complete of a medical facility as you would find on larger ships. So really sort of giving meaning to the title capital ship. They served as the capital providing little ships with things that the little ships did not have. Moving on, and the next place we're going to go is the engine room. Now, to get to the engine room, you got to go down a whole bunch of stairs and into some pretty cramped areas, by the way. Like, if you go down here, you'll see that the passageway is actually tiny. I mean, there's my foot for a size reference. But, of course, here you go. You eventually do get to the engine room. Now, the engine room on the Yorktown, the first thing you'll notice is, wow, it's a lot more spacious. If you compare it to the engine rooms on a destroyer or the engine room on board the battleships like the North Carolina, for example, the carrier's engine room just seemingly had a lot more space. It was a lot more roomy. On board the Yorktown, she had a total of 8 boilers, 4 geared steam turbines, driving 4 shafts with a total of 150,000 shaft horsepower, pushing her to a maximum speed of 33 knots when she was first built. In the later stages of her career, as she got modernized and they added new things, like for example an angled flight deck, there were obviously things they had to do to make the ship more stable. So of course they added things like blisters and things like that, and of course top speed was reduced to pretty much closer to 30 knots. Anyways, now for those of you who've watched my Yorktown and Wisconsin video, and even for those of you who haven't, you should go check that out, by the way, you'll probably notice that many of the things that you're seeing right now in the engine room on board the Yorktown actually looks exactly like what you're seeing on the battleships. That's because the entire system is the same. You'll have the same system of boilers, the steam pressure going into the various turbines, the high pressure turbine, the low pressure turbine, and how those things interact with something called the reduction gear. It's all the same. And I mean, here's a small challenge. See if you can actually pick out those things in this particular clip. And of course, things like this control board are going to look identical, right? And I think the only real difference between, carriers and battleships and so on and so forth is just going to be how many RPMs you're going to need to turn that shaft in order to get how much speed. Does this little bit thing look familiar to you? Yeah, that's the low pressure turbine, right? So if you've seen this on the North Carolina or Wisconsin video, this is going to look quite familiar to you. What about that gray object that's coming into view now? Right, that's probably going to be the reduction gear. So it's really cool to actually see these things and then go, interesting. How standardized everything was on the various ships. I mean, you could essentially move from a battleship to a carrier if you were a sailor, and they wouldn't have to retrain you from top to bottom to operate a whole new set of machinery. Your skills from one ship to another would essentially be interchangeable. Moving away from the engine rooms, as I'm heading back up to the flight deck and the island area of the ship, you come across the squadron ready rooms. Now, the squadron ready rooms on the Yorktown today are not in the same places as the squadron ready rooms were when she was first built. They've actually been moved during her modifications, and there's a very good reason for that. During the Second World War, the USS Bunker Hill, another Essex-class carrier, was hit by 2 kamikazes. Now, at the time, the squadron ready rooms were up on the gallery level. Now, the gallery level was not protected by armor. The hangar floor was actually protected by some armor. And what ended up happening is that I believe 22 pilots of VF-84 perished in that one kamikaze attack. So, after the war, when the Essex-class carriers underwent their modifications, the Navy very quickly realized that the pilots needed better protection, so all the squadron ready rooms were moved below the hangar level so that there's actually armor above them, and therefore they would be better protected. As we go towards the flight deck and bridge area, we go back to the main hangar deck first. Now remember what I mentioned earlier, the squadron ready rooms got moved down below the hangar deck, so they'll be better protected. So we go back up, and as we go back up, we enter the gallery level, which is where this particular room is, along with some other important rooms. This one in particular is the Carrier Air Traffic Control Center, and it is responsible for the safe operation of aircraft in all weather conditions, very similar to the ATC at your local airport. Moving on, and we have the CIC, and the CIC is kind of right next to the Air Traffic Control Center. And the Combat Information Center is a very important area of the ship. Now, as technology evolved and there came ever more amounts of data, you needed a centralized place to process all that information and come up with a unified picture. And that's where the CIC really comes into its own. Its ability to take all sorts of data, like radar data, weather data, etc., putting it all together and sending it up to the people in command so that they are going to be able to have a very clear image of what's happening around them. Now, of course, the CIC concept actually evolved over time. In the early stages of World War II, when things like radar and stuff like that was still relatively unfamiliar, wasn't really sure exactly how to go about using all of that information. As the war progressed and some painful lessons were learned, as well as some very valuable lessons, then the doctrine for how a CIC should be used evolved, and fleets became more and more efficient at the ability to coordinate, the ability to direct things, etc., etc., etc. This particular plot, for example, is the anti-aircraft gunfire coordination plot. So, if you picked up, let's say, enemy aircraft at a certain direction, you could plot it onto this particular plot and know where, in which direction, to direct your anti-aircraft guns. And this is not the only kind of plot that you would see in a CIC. Other kinds of plots would probably be things like, where your combat air patrols are, where do you want to direct your fighters, and many other essential aspects of, having a ship in combat. And the CIC as a whole, if you have a clear picture as a commander and you know where things are and you know how to react to threats, there's a lot less chance of you being surprised. And mind you, in warfare, there's still always that chance, right? But at least you reduce the risk of that. And with any kind of warfare, the less surprises you have, the more likely you're going to be able to control how that battle is going to turn out. So we're going to exit the CIC now and head towards the flight deck. And finally, we get to the actual flight deck of the Yorktown. And the first two things you're going to notice is A, the huge flight deck, and B, of course, you'll notice the island superstructure. This island superstructure, of course, is actually not the original one on the Essex class carriers. They've been modified during the modifications. On the superstructure area, you'll see the combat ribbons. The Yorktown also happened to have gotten 17 battle stars and the Presidential Unit Citation, which is the top ribbon that you see over there. Now, the next part is actually quite cool, and it's basically a tally of how the Yorktown's air groups did during the Second World War. And you'll see the aircraft shot down, aircraft destroyed on the ground, etc. So here we go. Air Group 5, Air Group 1, Air Group 3. There's actually two more, and they were all in service at different periods of time. Now take a look and pay attention to the number of aircraft shot down, the number of aircraft destroyed on the ground, the number of ships that were damaged, the number of ships that were sunk. In particular, Air Group 1 was responsible for damaging the Zuikaku. And then, of course, you also have Air Group 9, which was around in 1945, and they were responsible for the sinking of the Yamato, as well as the Yahagi. And then, of course, you have Air Group 88, which was around right near the end of the war, and they were responsible for the sinking of the battleship Haruna and the cruiser Oyoto. So, take a look at the tally over the years that she was in service during the Second World War, which was only about 2 years. Look at all the planes that she shot down, all the land targets she struck, ships that she was able to sink. And then you compare it to a battleship. So this is a picture from the USS North Carolina, and yes, the North Carolina was able to shoot down aircraft, it was able to bombard targets on land, it was able to, sink the occasional ship, but comparatively speaking, for the amount of resources that you would dedicate to battleships versus a carrier, you get far better returns with the carrier. There was just so much more striking power, and the ability to really damage the enemy was that much greater. So, in a way, just by taking a look at sort of the statistics of damage done, you kind of see why battleships were really becoming obsolete. Alright, so now, before I talk a bit more about the actual deck area, let's go check out the island. Now, I've done this for the Intrepid before, so for those of you who still remember that video way back where I did the USS Intrepid, the Yorktown and the Intrepid are very similar in terms of the island superstructure and all the things that are there. So things that dealt with navigation, the operation of the ship itself, etc., the command and control of the flight deck, that would all be done from the island area. Now, on the Yorktown, on the starboard signal bridge, there was a bomb hit during World War II. March the 18th, 1945, a Japanese dive bomber managed to get a bomb there, ended up killing 5 men, wounding a whole bunch of others, and so there, that black circle on the ground there, that's where the bomb hit. So there's a picture of that bomb hit. Still, the carrier continued to operate even after the hit without any problems and was able to conduct operations. So moving on, we have the Admiral's sea cabin, and as you can tell, it's a very nice room, and mind you, the island area is not a huge amount of space, so to get a nice room like that and have your own cabin just really shows that rank has its privileges. And yeah, if you want to go to the Navy, go be an officer. Yes, increased responsibilities, but at least you get to be comfortable. Moving on, and we come to the navigator's chart room. Although at first I wanted to turn around and go up some more, but it's closed off. My guess is that up there might be where you would have the, like where the air boss would be controlling of the aircraft on the flight deck, but the area is closed off, so wasn't able to see that area. If you actually go back to the earlier picture where I had the sort of the entire picture of the island superstructure, you'll notice that at the back there's, like even higher up, there's a glassed area where you could essentially keep an eye on the flight deck, but closed off, so never got a chance to go there. So this is the navigator's chart room, and as you can tell, this is the ability for the navigator to keep track of where the ship is. This is called the reckoning tracer, so it basically receives directional signals from the ship's compass, distance signals, etc., and it's able to map where the ship is going. And it's very, very close to the actual track of the ship. The next thing you see is the relative bearing plotter, and this was actually used for the Apollo 8 space shuttle recovery. So the USS Yorktown, during her career, at one point in time, recovered the Apollo 8 command capsule. One cool thing I sort of forgot to mention on the hangar deck is that if you go past some of the World War II aircraft, it was actually like, I don't know, a mock-up of the sort of space command capsule, and you could actually like get in there, lie on your back, and pretend you were an astronaut for a second. And yes, I did that twice. Don't judge me. Don't judge me for that. Anyways, what's in front of you here, these are marine chronometers, very, very accurate time instruments, and mostly used for, I believe, aiding in celestial navigation. You really need to be very, very accurate with your time, so you're not like navigating into places that you don't want to go. Alright, so we're going to exit the navigator's chart room, and before we go, there's a little bit of a comic. It was some unsuspected isle in the far seas, as the comic shows the Yorktown ramming into an island. Not something that would be unfamiliar for those of us who play World of Warships. I mean, we do have a tendency of occasionally running into islands. Obviously, we don't have proper navigators on our ships. That's the reason why. I thought it was pretty neat, little piece of art. And of course, exiting that area, and we're heading towards the pilot house. Yes, there was a general quarters alarm. Yes, I pressed that button. Unfortunately, the sound on this particular little action cam was really bad. It picked up a lot of background noise, so I actually cut it out just because it actually sounded just terrible. But anyways, pilot house. So, if you were the person who was responsible for obeying instructions and turning ships to a certain direction and stuff like that, this is where you would be. Now, to my knowledge, this area actually was armored a little bit. Now, they didn't put in a conning tower like they did on battleships because that was just a little bit too much weight. But, this area did at least offer a little bit of protection to the person at the helm. Although, it is also quite clear that, if you're at the helm, you're mostly just following instructions as to which direction to turn to, etc., etc., etc. You're not really having much of a view outside of this particular area. You don't really get to see exactly where you're going. One other neat piece of instrumentation in the pilot house is this clinometer. Now, the clinometer was used to measure the ship's roll from side to side. The USS Yorktown, during the typhoon in December of 1944, that really big one that ended up sinking 3 U.S. destroyers, well, during that typhoon, she was rolling from side to side like 19 degrees, which when you think about the fact that she's this huge carrier, that's quite a substantial roll. Alright, so we're going to leave the pilot house and we're going to enter the actual open bridge area. This is the area where you really get a really nice view outside. This is the captain's sea cabin. Again, you'll notice the sort of the placement of this particular cabin, right next to the pilot house. In the event he gets called out, he immediately can get his bearings and know where he's going. This area here, this is the docking bridge. So when the carrier comes into port and needs to dock, well, the captain needs a specific place in order to see where he is going. So kind of a cool view from here. As you can tell, we're quite high up as well. As we turn around, there is an instrument that I want you to take a look at. That one over there, that is an alidate compass ring. And what you use that for is to sight a distant object visually, and then by using that particular object that you're looking at to figure out bearing and direction. So quite a neat little instrument. Alright, so now we're going to continue. I'm going to turn around and we're going to continue onto the actual bridge. And that will be the captain's bridge. And you'll notice that the captain's bridge has the best forward view of the ship. Now, since the captain is responsible for making sure his ship is going the right place and being aware of his surroundings and everything, as you can tell, this is the absolute best view, right? From here, you can see everything that's happening in front of you and around you. In terms of the two aircraft that you see, where essentially the two catapults would be, there's an F-4 Phantom, which never served aboard the ship, as well as an E-1B Tracer. Now, that particular aircraft did serve on board this carrier, serving as the AWACS platform. Now, as I sort of turned around a little bit too quickly there, if you looked out the window that I was just looking at earlier, not this one, the one on the side here, there we go, this one, you might notice that there is an angled deck on the USS Yorktown. Now, the angled deck was put onto the Yorktown during her SCB-125 modification. Now, remember earlier I mentioned that she went through the SCB-27A modification? Well, the angled deck actually came later, and the reason why that angled deck was put in was because as the Navy started operating jet aircraft, they quickly realized that if something went wrong, they would have a really bad accident on their hands. So they looked for a solution, and once again, somebody from the Royal Navy had just that solution, which was an angled flight deck. And the idea was that if the pilot came in, tried to land, missed the wires, they could just simply power up again and take off again, instead of, missing that wire and then running into the aircraft that were waiting in front of it. Where I am right now, this is one of the areas for radar. Now, the radar has been removed, of course, but one cool thing I learned about Essex-class carriers is that if you look at Essex-class carrier photos from the Second World War, you can pretty much identify them based on the radar equipment that they were carrying. There were just so many individual sort of different kinds of sets being experimented with on various carriers that they served almost as an identifying feature of that particular ship. One final thing that I learned while I was at the museum, and this is completely unrelated to the ship, just a cool thing altogether, check out these copies of the surrender document. So on the left, you see the US copy, and you notice that all the signatures are perfectly done. And on the right hand side is the Japanese copy of the surrender document, and you'll notice that the Canadian representative signed in the wrong place. Oh, Canada. On such an important occasion to just accidentally sign on the wrong line. Maybe this is the reason why Canadians, we tend to apologize so much and continuously say sorry even for things that we don't get wrong. We're just afraid something like this might happen, right? Anyway, so yeah, one cool final random fact for all of you. And that does it for this Know Your Ship episode, folks, on the USS Yorktown. Now, I personally would recommend that if you're interested, that you should go and see this ship in person, because there is just so many more things that I wasn't able to cover in this video that you will get to discover on the ship in person. One final thing, of course, happy belated birthday to JohnMan0499. Happy birthday, hope you had a really good one. I promised I would give you a shout out in this video. One final thing, of course, patrons, thank you all so much for your support. Without you guys, there's no way I could have taken a quick breather from World of Warships to go ahead and just work on these things for a while. So thank you all for your support. You guys are phenomenal and allow me to just do things that I absolutely love. So thank you all so much. Aside from all that, folks, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again really soon.